The unexpected passenger. The air buzzed with the usual hum of an airport terminal as Sarah Evans adjusted her pristine blue uniform and straightened the small golden wings pinned to her chest. Her blonde hair was styled in a sleek bun, a deliberate nod to the disciplined appearance her airline demanded. 10 years into her career as a flight attendant, Sarah was used to the chaos of airports, the clamor of passengers shuffling between gates, last-minute boarding announcements, and the hurried footsteps of travelers racing against time. Today was supposed to be a routine flight, a short but busy route from Los Angeles to New York. Sarah had been assigned to first class again, a position she prided herself on. To her, serving first-class passengers wasn't just a role, it was a badge of honor. These were the elite. Executives, celebrities, and business leaders who exuded the kind of wealth and status that matched the luxuriously padded seats they occupied. Sarah had grown used to their demands: an extra glass of champagne, an adjusted pillow, or a perfectly timed tray of hors d'oeuvres. To her, appearances mattered. First-class passengers were polished and poised, and in her mind, they looked the part. The boarding process began smoothly. Sarah greeted passengers with her signature smile, a careful blend of professionalism and warmth, while taking mental notes of their tailored suits, designer handbags, and expensive perfumes. It was easy to recognize the VIPs, those whose every gesture and accessory declared, "I belong here." But then he boarded. An older black man, dressed in a modest, well-worn gray suit, stepped into the cabin with a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with the space around him. He carried nothing but a scuffed leather briefcase, which he clutched firmly by his side. His hair was salt and pepper, neatly combed back, and his face bore the lines of age and experience. Yet there was something about him, a stillness, a serenity, that caught Sarah off guard. "Good afternoon, sir. Can I see your boarding pass?" she asked politely, though her tone carried an unintentional edge of doubt. The man offered her a gentle smile as he reached into his pocket and handed over his ticket. "Certainly, young lady." Sarah glanced at the boarding pass, her eyes darting between the paper and the man in front of her. The ticket was valid. Seat 1A, a prime spot reserved for those who typically paid thousands for the privilege. Yet she couldn't help the creeping feeling of suspicion. He didn't look like the other passengers. His suit lacked the pristine crispness of a corporate CEO. His shoes, though polished, had seen better days. "Are you sure this is your seat?" she asked, her smile faltering. The man's face remained calm, though his eyes, dark, intelligent, and kind, held an unreadable depth. "Yes, ma'am," he replied softly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had weathered many storms. "That's my seat." Sarah hesitated, her fingers tightening on the boarding pass. She couldn't shake the nagging thought that there had been a mistake. First class was reserved for those who belonged, those who matched the cabin's aura of exclusivity. And this man, with his unassuming demeanor, seemed misplaced. Could he have sneaked his way in? She wondered. "I'll just need to verify," Sarah said stiffly. "Please take a seat for now." The man nodded without protest, his movements slow but deliberate as he walked to seat 1A and sat down. He placed his briefcase gently on his lap, his eyes drifting to the window as if watching the world go by. Sarah made her way to the front, stopping by her colleague, Amanda, who was finishing a final check of the cabin. "Did you see the guy in seat 1A?" Sarah whispered, her voice laced with incredulity. Amanda raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, what about him?" "Something feels off. He doesn't look like a first-class passenger." Amanda shot her a warning glance. "Sarah, seriously, don't start with that." "I'm just saying," Sarah replied defensively. "It wouldn't be the first time someone tried to slip into first class." Amanda sighed and shook her head. "Trust the system, Sarah. If he has a valid ticket, it's valid. Leave him be." But Sarah's instincts, or perhaps her biases, refused to settle. She moved toward the man again, this time with a more authoritative posture. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her tone sharper than before. "I'm going to need to verify your identification." The man looked up at her, his expression unshaken. "Of course," he said, his voice still soft. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out his driver's license, handing it to her without hesitation. Sarah examined it closely. His name was James Carter. The ID matched the ticket. Everything was in order. And yet, a strange mix of doubt and frustration twisted in her stomach. "Thank you," she muttered curtly, handing back the license. She turned to leave but couldn't help noticing a few passengers nearby watching her, with raised brows and subtle frowns. One woman in a Channel blazer shook her head disapprovingly, as if silently asking, "Why are you harassing this man?" Sarah's cheeks burned, but she shook it off. "I'm just doing my job," she told herself. The weight of judgments. As the flight prepared for takeoff, Sarah busied herself with final checks, her thoughts lingering uneasily on James Carter. From the corner of her eye, she watched him, his posture relaxed, his gaze fixed on the sky outside. He didn't seem bothered by her questioning, which somehow only aggravated her further. It was as though he carried himself with a quiet assurance that made her discomfort more glaring. The cabin soon settled into its rhythm. Soft chimes signaled the end of the seatbelt sign, and Sarah moved to begin the first round of service. With her silver tray of drinks and a perfectly rehearsed smile, she started at the front. "Champagne, sir?" she asked as she approached James. He looked up at her, his smile kind and genuine. "No, thank you. Just water, please." Sarah nodded, pouring the water and placing it gently on his tray table. "Let me know if you need anything," she said, trying to maintain her composure. James responded with a simple thank you and returned to his thoughts. As Sarah continued her rounds, snippets of conversation drifted through the cabin. "Is that James Carter?" a man whispered to his wife across the aisle. "It can't be. He's one of the richest men in the country." Her ears perked up, and Sarah's hands faltered slightly as she set down a glass of champagne. "Did I hear that right?" "That's definitely him," the wife replied in an awed hush. "I saw his interview on TV last month. He's a philanthropist, runs one of the largest charities in the world. I read he grew up with nothing, built his fortune from scratch." Sarah froze momentarily, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced back at James Carter, still seated calmly in 1A, oblivious to the quiet whispers around him. A billionaire. Her mind reeled as the realization sank in. Suddenly, her earlier behavior played back in her head like a cruel highlight reel. The doubting questions, the skeptical glances, the unnecessary request for ID. All of it now seemed unbearably small and shameful. He's a billionaire, and I treated him like a fraud. The weight of her assumptions crushed her. The quiet consequence. As the flight settled into cruise altitude, Sarah retreated to the small galley at the front of the plane, her mind racing. She felt a gnawing discomfort that she couldn't shake. The whispers from the passengers echoed in her ears. James Carter wasn't just a wealthy man. He was someone deeply respected, someone whose name carried the weight of extraordinary achievements and generosity. And she had judged him, dismissed him, solely based on how he looked. "Everything okay?" Amanda asked, breaking Sarah's spiraling thoughts. "Yeah," Sarah replied quickly, though her voice sounded strained. She busied herself rearranging glasses, avoiding Amanda's knowing gaze. "You know," Amanda added quietly, "I told you to trust the system. You're lucky he's as gracious as he is." Sarah opened her mouth to respond but stopped. What could she say? Amanda was right. Her actions had been unfair, unkind, and above all, unprofessional. For the first time in her career, Sarah felt deeply out of step with the values she had claimed to uphold. As the flight continued, she found herself glancing at James Carter more frequently. He'd never once complained, never once demanded special treatment. He simply sat there, his hands resting on his briefcase, his gaze lost in the expanse of clouds outside. And somehow, that made her regret even heavier. Sarah realized then that this flight, This moment would follow her long after the plane touched down. But she had no idea that the ripples of her behavior would soon spiral into a reckoning unlike anything she had ever imagined. The whispered storm. Sarah couldn't escape the disquiet gnawing at her as the flight sailed smoothly through the sky. The man she had misjudged, James Carter, remained calm, a lighthouse of composure amid her spiraling thoughts. She could feel it now, the weight of invisible eyes watching her from all directions. Even when passengers didn't look directly at her, the air seemed charged, as though everyone had silently formed an opinion. Her professionalism, once a shield, felt brittle. The voice of the pilot crackled over the intercom, briefly breaking her haze. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached cruising altitude. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight." Sarah clutched the drink tray in her hand like it was her only anchor. Every step down the first-class aisle felt heavier. Her colleague Amanda had stayed silent, but the way she moved around Sarah, brief glances and tight lips, made the unspoken tension harder to bear. The whispers about James Carter being a billionaire had not stayed contained to the rows nearest to him. It was as though a rumor had sprouted wings and flown through the entire cabin. Sarah could hear snippets of hushed conversation as she served drinks. "That's really him. Did you hear what happened earlier?" She doubted him. "Doesn't she know who he is?" Sarah forced herself to maintain her plastic smile, but her heart beat loudly in her chest. It was as if the cabin had turned into a courtroom and she was on trial. Her cheeks flushed when her mind replayed the dismissive tone she'd used on James, her insistence to see his ticket, the way she'd held his ID under the cabin lights like some crude interrogation. "You didn't treat him like a person," the voice in her head accused. "You treated him like a problem to be solved." As Sarah moved down the aisle with forced calm, a middle-aged woman in a neatly tailored skirt suit caught her eye. The woman's expression was sharp as a scalpel. "Excuse me," the woman said with a clipped tone, stopping Sarah in her tracks. She leaned slightly toward Sarah and lowered her voice, but her words hit like stones. "I couldn't help but notice how you handled Mr. Carter earlier. Do you realize who you were speaking to?" Sarah's lips parted, but no words came out. "He's not just some man in a suit," the woman continued, her disapproval evident. "That's James Carter, philanthropist, business mogul, a man who's probably done more good in a single year than most people do in a lifetime." Sarah stammered, but the woman waved a hand dismissively. "It's shameful," she finished, "for someone in your position to make assumptions like that." With that, she turned her attention back to her laptop, leaving Sarah standing there like a scolded child. The calm before the reckoning. When Sarah finally retreated to the galley at the front of the plane, her hands were trembling. She placed the tray of empty glasses on the counter and pressed her palms flat against the cool metal surface, forcing herself to breathe. "Pull it together," she told herself. Amanda appeared beside her. "You okay?" Sarah gave a short nod, but Amanda didn't look convinced. "You've been off all flight," Amanda said carefully, "and people are noticing." Sarah's temper flared despite herself. "I know, okay. I know." Amanda folded her arms, lowering her voice. "You might want to apologize to him." The suggestion hit Sarah like a slap. "Apologize? To him? I was just doing my job." Amanda's eyes narrowed. "Were you? Or were you letting your assumptions decide how you treated him?" Sarah opened her mouth to argue but shut it again. A bitter silence hung between them, Amanda's words lingering in the tight space of the galley. Sarah turned her back, pretending to organize the cutlery, but inside, the fight had drained out of her. Was Amanda right? The man behind the window. As the flight stretched on, Sarah found herself stealing glances at James Carter again. He still hadn't spoken up, still hadn't complained. He sat quietly, his eyes turned toward the clouds, as if the world inside the plane didn't exist. For some reason, his calm unnerved her more than if he had caused a scene. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah made a decision. She didn't care how embarrassed she was. She needed to set things right, for her own sake. Even if he dismissed her, even if he brushed her off, she would apologize. Her heart hammered as she approached seat 1A. James turned his head as she neared, offering the same quiet smile she had seen before. "Sir," she began softly, her voice quieter than she intended. "Mr. Carter, I just wanted to apologize for earlier." James regarded her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "For what, young lady?" Sarah blinked, caught off guard. I questioned you when you boarded. I treated you like you didn't belong. And that wasn't right." James didn't say anything for a beat, and the silence stretched so long that Sarah wondered if he was deciding how best to dismiss her. But then he spoke. "Tell me something," James said gently, his voice even. "Why did you assume I didn't belong here?" Sarah opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. The truth, raw and unflattering, burned on her tongue. She hesitated. "I don't know." James didn't look angry. If anything, he looked sad. "Think on it," he said simply, his tone not unkind. "Sometimes the hardest answers are the ones we don't want to hear." The whispered message. For the rest of the flight, Sarah felt like she was moving through a fog. Her encounter with James played on a loop in her mind. "Why did you assume I didn't belong?" She replayed his question again and again, but the answers were fragments she couldn't piece together yet. The truth lingered in the back of her mind, clawing its way closer. Near the end of the flight, as the plane began its descent, Sarah noticed something strange. Amanda, who had been by her side all day, was now whispering with the captain near the cockpit door. The captain's face was a mixture of surprise and something else, concern. Sarah's stomach twisted. Moments later, Amanda returned to the galley, her face pale. "Sarah," she whispered urgently, "do you have any idea who James Carter really is?" Sarah frowned. "Yeah, I've heard the whispers. He's a billionaire." Amanda shook her head quickly, her voice dropping even lower. "Not just that. His company, Carter Global Enterprises, just bought the airline's parent company." The words struck Sarah like a thunderclap. Her eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "Wait, what?" Amanda nodded gravely. "That's right. He owns the airline now. As in, we work for him." Sarah's knees nearly buckled. It felt as though the cabin tilted sharply beneath her feet. James Carter wasn't just a first-class passenger or a billionaire philanthropist. He was now her boss. The weight of it hit her like a freight train, and she had disrespected him. The final landing. When the plane touched down and rolled to the gate, Sarah felt like a prisoner walking toward her sentence. The usual bustle of landing, passengers grabbing bags, conversations starting up, sounded muted, as though she was underwater. Her face burned as she thought about everything that had happened. The misplaced questions, her defensive tone, her assumption that James Carter didn't belong. As James Carter stood and retrieved his modest leather briefcase from under the seat, he turned and met Sarah's gaze. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Good day, young lady," he said softly, his eyes warm but piercing, as though he could see straight through her. "Good day, sir," she whispered back, her voice barely audible. He nodded once and then moved down the aisle, disappearing into the crowd of passengers disembarking. Sarah stood frozen, watching him go, a sinking realization settling deep within her. This was far from over. Whatever reckoning James Carter had planned, it had only just begun. The ground shifts. The moment Sarah stepped off the plane, she felt as if every eye in the terminal was trained on her. Of course, no one in the bustling airport knew about her earlier encounter with James Carter, nor did they care. The passengers from her flight had already dispersed into the crowd, luggage rolling behind them, voices echoing through the cavernous space. Yet Sarah couldn't shake the crawling sensation on the back of her neck. It wasn't paranoia. It was guilt, a heavy, unforgiving weight that had settled on her shoulders. Amanda walked beside her, their heels clicking in unison against the polished floor. "Sarah, you need to let this go," Amanda said softly. It's over. Sarah shook her head, her throat tight. No, it's not. You don't just disrespect someone like James Carter and move on. Amanda sighed. He was gracious, Sarah. He didn't make a scene, didn't ask for anything. He even smiled when he left. Exactly, Sarah replied, her voice strained. That's the problem. Amanda glanced at her, confusion flickering in her expression. How is that a problem? Sarah stopped walking, her fists clenched at her sides. Because someone with that kind of power doesn't have to make a scene. Do you think a man like him forgets something like this? No, he waits. He plans, and when the time is right, he strikes. Amanda's brow furrowed. Sarah, you're overthinking this. But Sarah wasn't so sure. Her mind replayed James Carter's calm, patient expression. The same one he wore when she challenged him, when he'd handed her his ID without protest. It was the kind of calm that came from someone who didn't need to say they had power because it was already understood. He owns the airline now, she reminded herself, her heart sinking. He owns everything. The email. 2 days later, Sarah sat in her cramped apartment, staring at the blinking notification on her phone. She'd been on edge since the flight, waiting for the fallout she was sure would come. Her manager had said nothing, and Amanda had texted her a dozen times urging her to relax. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of inevitability, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Now, as she stared at her phone, her heart pounded in her chest. The email's subject line was simple yet ominous. Mandatory meeting. Executive review. Sarah tapped the screen, her fingers trembling as she read the message. From Corporate Leadership Team. To Sarah Evans. Subject: Mandatory meeting. Executive review. Dear Sarah Evans, you are hereby requested to attend a private meeting with airline leadership regarding your recent conduct during Flight 1723. This meeting is scheduled for Monday, 9:00 a.m. at corporate headquarters. Your attendance is mandatory. Please come prepared to discuss the incident in detail. Sincerely, Corporate Management. The phone slipped from her fingers, clattering against the table. Her pulse roared in her ears. She reread the email, hoping she'd misunderstood, but the words didn't change. Executive review. Her stomach churned violently. She knew what that meant. She'd heard whispers about other employees who'd been summoned to review meetings. They were never good. Some were demoted, others quietly let go. Careers had been buried in rooms like the one she was now destined for. Sarah buried her face in her hands, her mind racing. This is it, she thought. James Carter didn't need to humiliate me on that plane. He's going to ruin me in a boardroom instead. Her breathing quickened as anxiety gripped her chest. She thought about all the years she'd devoted to the airline. The long hours, the stress, the sacrifices. And now, because of a single moment of arrogance, it could all come crashing down. The whispered threats. Monday came faster than Sarah could prepare for. She stood in front of the mirror in her small bathroom, staring at her reflection. Dark circles lingered beneath her eyes. She hadn't slept. Her uniform, a crisp blue jacket and matching skirt, felt suffocating, the fabric stiff against her skin. She pinned her hair into a bun, her hands trembling as she smoothed the flyaways. You can get through this, she whispered to herself, though she didn't believe it. The drive to corporate headquarters was silent and tense. Sarah clutched the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, the city blurring past her windows. By the time she arrived at the massive glass building downtown, she felt like a prisoner being marched to her sentencing. The receptionist greeted her with a polite smile that felt far too cheerful for the occasion. Good morning, Ms. Evans. They're expecting you in conference room C. Sarah nodded stiffly and made her way down the carpeted hallway. Her heels echoed ominously in the empty corridor. Outside the conference room, she paused, taking a deep breath before knocking. Come in, a voice called from within. Sarah pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was stark, white walls, a polished oak table, and a massive window overlooking the city skyline. 3 people sat at the table, their expressions unreadable. 2 were executives Sarah recognized from internal newsletters. The third, sitting at the head of the table, was James Carter. Her breath caught in her throat. James Carter looked different in a tailored charcoal suit. He exuded quiet authority, his eyes sharp but kind as they locked onto hers. He gestured toward the empty chair across the table. "Please, Ms. Evans, have a seat." Sarah nodded quickly and sat, trying to steady her shaking hands beneath the table. The questions begin. The woman to James's right, a stern-faced executive with short dark hair, spoke first. "Ms. Evans, you were involved in an incident during Flight 1723 with Mr. Carter, who now holds ownership of our airline's parent company. Would you care to explain your actions?" Sarah's throat felt like sandpaper. I questioned Mr. Carter when he boarded," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I asked to see his boarding pass and ID because I wasn't sure he belonged in first class." The room fell silent. James Carter finally spoke, his voice low and calm. "And why weren't you sure, Ms. Evans?" Sarah's chest tightened painfully. She glanced at him, searching for any sign of anger or malice in his expression, but found none. He was waiting for an answer. "I made an assumption," she said quietly, the words bitter on her tongue. "I looked at you and assumed you didn't belong." The admission hung in the air like a lead weight. James nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "Thank you for your honesty." The dark-haired executive continued. "Ms. Evans, our company prides itself on inclusivity and respect for all passengers. Incidents like this damage our reputation and undermine the trust our customers place in us. How do you suggest we address this?" Sarah blinked, taken aback. I don't know," she stammered. "I didn't mean to cause harm. It was a mistake." "Mistakes can be costly," the man to James's left said, his tone hard. "And they can have consequences." Sarah's heart sank. She felt as though the room was closing in on her, the walls pressing closer with every breath. The decision. James Carter leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "Ms. Evans," he began, his voice steady, "I don't believe in ruining careers over a single mistake, but I also don't believe in letting these moments go unaddressed." Sarah looked up, hope flickering faintly in her eyes. "Sir, He held up a hand, silencing her gently. "You need to understand the broader implications of what happened. Bias, whether conscious or not, affects how we treat others. It seeps into our actions, our assumptions, and our decisions. Do you understand that?" Sarah swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, sir, I do." James nodded in return. "Good, because I'm offering you an opportunity, Ms. Evans, one to learn and grow from this experience." She stared at him, confused. "And opportunity. You will attend mandatory diversity and sensitivity training," he said simply. "And when you've completed it, I want you to join our new Passenger Experience Committee, a team I'm assembling to ensure incidents like this don't happen again." Sarah blinked, stunned. "You want me on a committee?" "Yes," James replied. "You made a mistake. Now you have a chance to help fix the system that allows those mistakes to happen. I trust you'll take this seriously." Sarah's heart pounded. She had expected punishment, humiliation, maybe even termination. But this was something else, a second chance wrapped in responsibility. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice trembling. "I won't waste it." James' expression softened. "I hope not. Because this isn't just about you, Ms. Evans. It's about the kind of company we want to be." He stood, signaling the meeting was over. The other executives followed suit. Sarah rose as well, her legs unsteady. As she reached the door, James's voice stopped her. "Ms. Evans." She turned back, her pulse quickening. James offered her a faint, knowing smile. "Growth isn't comfortable, but it's necessary. The path to redemption." Sarah Evans stared at the elevator buttons in the towering corporate headquarters building. She had pressed the button for the 18th floor, home to the new Passenger Experience Committee, but her hand hovered over the panel, as though her body resisted the decision her mind had already made. What am I doing here? She thought for the 100th time that morning. The irony wasn't lost on her. 2 weeks ago, she'd been on the verge of losing her job. Now she was being asked to help rebuild the very system she had shaken. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Sarah stepped out onto a floor unlike any she'd ever seen. The space was modern, filled with natural light that spilled through massive windows, with sleek glass walls and minimalist furniture. Despite the open design, the energy in the room was focused and intense. A young woman in a charcoal suit greeted her as soon as Sarah entered. "Ms. Evans," the woman asked politely. "I'm Ulysses, Mr. Carter's assistant. Welcome to the Passenger Experience Committee. Mr. Carter has asked to see you in the conference room before today's orientation." Sarah's heart did a somersault at the mention of James Carter. She hadn't spoken to him since her executive review, though his words from that day still echoed in her mind. Growth isn't comfortable, but it's necessary. Sarah followed Elise through a glass hallway into a large conference room. There, standing at the window with his hands in his pockets, was James Carter. He turned as they entered, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever. "Good morning, Ms. Evans," he said. "Good morning, sir," Sarah replied softly, trying to steady her nerves. Elise nodded politely and excused herself, leaving them alone. James gestured to a seat at the table. "Please, sit." Sarah obeyed, her palms damp with sweat as she folded them tightly in her lap. James Carter remained standing for a moment, studying her with that same quiet intensity he carried everywhere. Finally, he spoke. "Tell me, Ms. Evans," he began, "do you understand why I brought you here?" Sarah hesitated, unsure of what he wanted to hear. "Because I made a mistake," she answered carefully. "And because you believe I can learn from it." James tilted his head slightly, his expression softening. "Partly. But it's more than that. You see, I don't just want you to learn from your mistake. I want you to help others avoid making the same one." Sarah frowned. "I don't know if I'm the right person for that, sir." James took a seat across from her. "Let me tell you something about mistakes," he said, his voice even and measured. "They are some of life's greatest teachers, if you're willing to learn. But true growth comes not when we stop at personal reflection, but when we take action to help others grow too." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze holding hers. "The Passenger Experience Committee is about transforming this airline, not just on paper, but in its culture. I want every passenger, no matter their appearance, background, or status, to be treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. And I need people who understand both sides of that coin to make it happen." Sarah swallowed hard. "Both sides." James smiled faintly. "Yes, you, Ms. Evans, have been both the one who judged and the one who faced judgment. You are uniquely positioned to bring empathy and insight to this team." The words hit Sarah like a bolt of lightning. For the first time, she saw the bigger picture of why James had chosen her. He wasn't punishing her. He was challenging her to be better, not just for herself, but for the passengers and employees who would cross her path in the future. "I'll do my best, sir," she said quietly. "I believe you will," James replied, rising to his feet. "Elise will show you to orientation. I'll join the committee later this afternoon to hear your ideas." Sarah stood, feeling both humbled and overwhelmed. As James opened the door for her, his final words lingered in her ears. "Remember, Ms. Evans, redemption isn't just earned, it's lived." The committee, the Passenger Experience Committee, was unlike anything Sarah had imagined. The team was small but diverse, made up of flight attendants, ground crew, management representatives, and even customer feedback specialists. At the center of it all was a mission statement plastered across the wall. "Every passenger matters. Every voice matters." Sarah sat around a circular table with her new colleagues, feeling out of place but determined to keep her head high. Orientation began with introductions. A tall black man named Marcus, who worked in customer relations, kicked things off. "I'm here because I've read thousands of complaints over the years about passengers being treated differently based on how they look," Marcus said bluntly. "It's about time we did something real about it." Next was Maya, a soft-spoken ground crew manager with sharp eyes. "I've seen my team mishandle complaints from passengers, often because they don't have the training to recognize when bias is involved. That has to change." The introductions continued, each person sharing their experiences and motivations. When it was Sarah's turn, all eyes turned to her. She felt heat creep up her neck, but forced herself to speak. "I'm here because I made a mistake," she admitted. "I judged someone based on an assumption I didn't even realize I carried. It was a wake-up call for me. And now, I want to help make sure no passenger ever feels what I caused Mr. Carter to feel." There was a moment of silence after she spoke. Sarah braced for judgment, but instead, Marcus nodded in approval. "Respect," he said simply. "Owning it is the first step." The tension in Sarah's chest eased slightly as the discussion moved forward. Challenging conversations. As the weeks passed, the committee met regularly to tackle the airline's issues head-on. They dissected customer complaints, reviewed employee training programs, and brainstormed initiatives to improve passenger experience. But it wasn't easy. One day, as the team reviewed a report highlighting bias incidents on flights, Marcus turned to Sarah. "Let's talk about unconscious bias," he said, his voice steady. "You've been on both sides now. What do you think triggers those kinds of assumptions?" Sarah hesitated. "I think sometimes we rely on shortcuts without realizing it. We see someone, and we fill in the blanks based on what we've been conditioned to believe. It's not always intentional, but it's still harmful." Maya chimed in. "So how do we retrain people to think differently?" Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "We need to start with awareness. People don't question their own biases because they don't see them. But if we create a program where employees learn to recognize those blind spots and practice empathy, we can start changing the way they interact with passengers." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That's a start." The room erupted into a lively discussion, with ideas flying back and forth. Sarah found herself fully engaged, her voice growing more confident as she contributed to the conversation. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she belonged, not just in the committee, but in the mission it represented. A surprise visit. One afternoon, midway through a particularly heated brainstorming session, the door to the conference room opened and all conversation stopped. James Carter stepped inside. The room shifted instantly. Shoulders straightened, gazes turned, but James's presence was as calm and unassuming as ever. He nodded politely as he moved to the front of the room. "I won't take much of your time," he said, his voice carrying just enough authority to command attention. "I've been following the committee's progress closely, and I'm impressed with the work you've done so far. But I want to challenge you to think bigger." He turned to face the room, his hands clasped in front of him. Improving passenger experience isn't just about policies and training. It's about culture. It's about creating an environment where every employee understands their role in making every passenger feel seen, respected, and valued. That kind of culture doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, commitment, and courage. His gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on Sarah before he continued. "You are the foundation of this change. And if we get it right, this airline won't just be better. It'll set a new standard for the industry." The room erupted into quiet applause as James stepped back. He nodded once more and left as quickly as he came, but his words hung in the air long after he was gone. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Culture. That's what James was building. He wasn't just changing policies. He was changing people, including her. Reflection. That night, Sarah sat in her apartment with a notebook in front of her, jotting down ideas for the committee. Her thoughts were clearer now, her purpose sharper. She thought about her mistake on that fateful flight, how one moment of judgment had brought her to this point. But she also thought about the man who had given her a second chance. James Carter didn't just see her mistake, he saw her potential. And now it was up to her to live up to it. She wrote 3 words at the top of the page. Change begins here. With a deep breath, she picked up her pen and started to write. The winds of change. The crisp early morning air stung Sarah Evans' face as she exited her car in the vast parking lot outside corporate headquarters. It had been a month since she joined the Passenger Experience Committee, and the weight of her new responsibility pressed on her shoulders every day. The path James Carter had set her on was far from easy. Though her work with the committee was fulfilling, it was also exposing uncomfortable truths, not just about the airline, but about herself. Change isn't comfortable, James' words often echoed in her mind. As Sarah walked through the sleek lobby, employees moved briskly, many greeting her with nods or polite smiles. But some still looked at her with lingering skepticism, as though they weren't sure whether she belonged in her new role. It stung, but Sarah didn't let it stop her. If James Carter believed in her, she would see this through. Today was a critical day. The committee was preparing to roll out its first major initiative, a new bias awareness and passenger inclusivity program, a plan Sarah had been instrumental in developing. Its success or failure would determine whether the committee had real influence. Introducing the plan. The committee's meeting room buzzed with energy as Sarah entered. Marcus was already at the head of the table, speaking animatedly with Maya, who held a thick binder filled with data and reports. Other committee members reviewed notes, rehearsed talking points, and exchanged nervous glances. "All right, people," Marcus said, clapping his hands for attention as Sarah took her seat. "Today's the big day. Mr. Carter will be reviewing our program at 2:00 p.m., and we need to make sure it's airtight. Let's go over everything one more time," Maya added, her tone firm. "We're not just pitching ideas here. We're presenting a vision for this airline's future." Sarah nodded, flipping through the program outline she had worked on tirelessly. It was a comprehensive plan designed to address the unconscious biases employees carried and improve the way passengers were treated. It included bias awareness workshops, mandatory sessions for employees focused on recognizing and addressing unconscious biases, empathy simulations, real-world scenarios for flight attendants, gate agents, and customer service staff to experience how their actions could impact passengers. Anonymous feedback portals, a system for passengers and employees to report issues safely and without fear of retaliation. Passenger inclusivity policies, revised protocols for handling boarding procedures, seating conflicts, and interactions with passengers from diverse backgrounds. Sarah had poured herself into every detail, determined to turn her mistake into meaningful change. But as she reviewed the documents, doubts crept in. Would it work? Would employees take it seriously? Or would they resist, dismissing the program as unnecessary? "Sarah," Marcus said, breaking her thoughts, "you're leading the presentation this afternoon. You good?" Her stomach flipped. "Me? I thought you or Maya." "No," Maya interrupted, her voice soft but resolute. "This is your idea. You fought for this. You deserve to be the one to present it." Sarah hesitated, the weight of the responsibility settling on her shoulders. She looked around the room, seeing the trust in her colleagues' faces. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about all of them. "All right," she said finally, squaring her shoulders. "Let's do this." The presentation. By the time 2:00 p.m. arrived, Sarah felt like she had been on a roller coaster of nerves and adrenaline. She stood at the front of the conference room, a massive screen behind her displaying the words, "Elevating every passenger's experience. A cultural transformation." The committee sat behind her for support, and at the far end of the table was James Carter. He watched her with the same calm intensity that had unsettled her on their first meeting, but this time, Sarah found it reassuring. It was a reminder that he believed in her. "Good afternoon," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "We're here today to introduce a program we believe will redefine this airline's commitment to its passengers, all its passengers." She clicked to the first slide, detailing the bias awareness workshops. For many of us, bias isn't something we think about. It's something we act on without realizing it. These workshops will help employees recognize and challenge the assumptions they carry, ensuring every passenger is treated with fairness and respect. James' gaze remained steady as he nodded faintly, encouraging her to continue. Sarah moved on to the empathy simulations, describing how employees would experience real-world scenarios that highlighted how seemingly small actions, like dismissing a passenger's request, could have a profound impact. She caught glimpses of executives exchanging looks, their expressions ranging from intrigue to skepticism. It was clear some of them were wary of the program's bold approach. Lastly, Sarah said, finishing strong, "The anonymous feedback portal ensures accountability at every level. Passengers and employees alike will have a safe way to report concerns, giving leadership the tools to address issues proactively." She clicked to the final slide, which read, "Building a culture where everyone belongs." Sarah turned back to the room, taking a steadying breath. This program isn't just about training or policies. It's about building a culture of empathy, fairness, and accountability. A culture that reflects the values this airline wants to stand for. She paused, her voice softening. "We all have blind spots. I've learned it the hard way. But acknowledging them, and choosing to do better, is what sets us apart." Silence followed her final words. Sarah's heart pounded in the stillness as she waited for a response. Finally, James Carter leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. "Thank you, Ms. Evans," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is a bold proposal, one that challenges not just our systems, but our thinking. And bold thinking is exactly what this company needs." A wave of relief washed over Sarah, and her shoulders relaxed slightly. But James added, his gaze sweeping the room, "Change isn't easy. It will face resistance. Some employees may reject these ideas outright. How will we ensure this program succeeds?" Sarah hesitated, but Marcus jumped in. "By leading from the top, Mr. Carter. If leadership sets the example, the rest of the team will follow." James nodded approvingly. "Good. Let's move forward with a pilot rollout. Start with select crews, measure the impact, and refine as needed. If the data supports the program, we'll expand it system-wide." A ripple of excitement ran through the room. The program had been greenlit. As the meeting adjourned, James approached Sarah while the others gathered their things. "Well done, Ms. Evans," he said quietly. "I hope you're starting to see why I brought you onto this committee." Sarah nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you for giving me the chance." "Remember," James said, his tone serious, "this isn't just about fixing one mistake. It's about helping others see the world differently." Resistance in the ranks. The pilot program began 2 weeks later, starting with a small group of flight crews. Sarah volunteered to oversee the first bias awareness workshop, eager to see the program in action. She walked into the training room with a mix of hope and trepidation, holding a clipboard and trying to look more confident than she felt. The flight attendants seated at the tables looked wary, their expressions ranging from polite interest to outright skepticism. One man, a tall, broad-shouldered senior attendant named Greg, sat with his arms crossed and an obvious scowl on his face. Sarah began the session with introductions and a brief explanation of why they were there. "This isn't about blame," she said, meeting their eyes. "It's about awareness. We're all here to learn and grow." Greg snorted. "Learn what?" "How to tiptoe around passengers so we don't offend them." A ripple of murmurs ran through the room, and Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She knew there would be pushback, but facing it head-on was more intimidating than she'd expected. "Bias isn't always intentional," Sarah replied calmly. "Sometimes it's the result of habits we don't even realize we have." Greg leaned back in his chair, smirking. "I've been doing this job for 20 years without any complaints. Maybe the problem isn't us. It's passengers who are too sensitive." A few attendees nodded, and Sarah felt the room teetering on the edge of rebellion. But then she remembered James' words. Growth isn't comfortable, but it's necessary. She took a steadying breath. "I used to think the same way," she said, her voice softer now. "That's what led me to treat a passenger unfairly, because I assumed I knew who he was. I was wrong. And I hurt someone because of it." The room fell quiet. "This program isn't about punishing you," Sarah continued. "It's about making sure we never let assumptions get in the way of treating people with the respect they deserve. We're here to make this airline better, together." Greg didn't respond, but his smirk faded. Sarah saw the shift in his expression. Subtle, but there. Turning point. Over the next few weeks, Sarah continued overseeing workshops, leading discussions, and gathering feedback. It wasn't easy. Some employees resisted, others grumbled, but slowly the tides began to turn. One day, Greg approached her after a session. "I still don't like these workshops," he admitted gruffly. "But you made me think about some stuff. And maybe that's a start." Sarah smiled faintly. "That's all we're asking for. A quiet victory." Late one night, Sarah sat alone in the committee room, reviewing data from the pilot program. Early results showed a noticeable improvement in passenger satisfaction and employee interactions. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As she leaned back in her chair, her phone buzzed with a new email. She opened it and froze. It was from James Carter. Subject: "Well done." Message: "Ms. Evans, you're proving that change is possible. Keep going." A quiet smile spread across Sarah's face. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The ultimate test. 2 months had passed since the Passenger Experience Committee rolled out its pilot programs, and Sarah Evans could see the first signs of change beginning to ripple across the airline. Reports showed an uptick in passenger satisfaction. Employee engagement had increased, and feedback about inclusivity was finally being taken seriously. The bias awareness workshops had been expanded to multiple airports, and the anonymous feedback portal had begun surfacing long-overlooked issues. Sarah often worked late into the night with Marcus, Maya, and the others, reviewing reports, refining policies, and ensuring the program had momentum. But progress was never smooth. Resistance still lingered in pockets of the airline. Some employees viewed the changes as unnecessary. Others quietly undermined the efforts with dismissive comments and outright pushback. Sarah had learned to expect this. Systemic change never came without struggle. Small steps, James Carter had told her in one of their private meetings. Cultural transformation isn't an overnight victory. It's a war won through persistence. Sarah held on to those words now because she would need them. Crisis at Gate 14. The morning began like any other at Los Angeles International Airport, with passengers bustling through terminals, dragging wheeled luggage, and sipping overpriced coffees. Sarah was on site to observe employee interactions as part of a surprise spot check for the program. She wore a casual blazer over her uniform, blending in as she quietly watched boarding processes unfold. That's when it happened. Near Gate 14, a situation was brewing. A mother and her young son, both black, were waiting in line to board first class. The mother wore a crisp beige trench coat and carried a designer handbag, while her son clutched a stuffed tiger under one arm and a small backpack in the other. The boy looked excited, bouncing slightly on his feet. At the gate podium, Sarah saw Greg, the flight attendant who'd once resisted the workshops, speaking with a fellow gate agent, his expression tight. His gaze flicked back to the woman and her son before he leaned toward the agent. "Are we sure they're in the right line?" Greg said, his voice low, but Sarah heard it clearly from where she stood. "They don't look first class." The words froze Sarah where she stood. The blood drained from her face, and for a brief moment, She felt herself pulled back to her own mistake months ago. The way she had questioned James Carter. The way her bias had spoken for her without her even realizing it. And now here it was again. The same prejudice, playing out before her. The gate agent hesitated. "They're on the manifest. Greg," she said uncertainly, glancing at her screen. Greg frowned, clearly unconvinced. "I'll just double-check." The woman caught the tension in their voices and straightened her posture, her smile fading. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. Sarah couldn't stand by. She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "Greg," she said firmly. Greg turned, startled. "Sarah, what are you?" "I'm here to observe, but apparently I need to intervene," she said, locking eyes with him. She turned to the mother and offered a reassuring smile. "Ma'am, we're happy to have you and your son boarding first class today. Please, go right ahead." The mother nodded cautiously, murmuring a quiet thank you, before she and her son stepped past the gate and onto the jet bridge. Sarah turned back to Greg, her expression hard. "What was that about?" Greg shrugged, crossing his arms defensively. "I was just verifying their boarding status." "No," Sarah said sharply. "You made an assumption based on how they looked. The same kind of assumption this program is supposed to eradicate." Greg's face flushed. You know better." Sarah cut him off. "Or at least you should know better by now." Greg opened his mouth to argue, but the weight of her words and the quiet disapproval of the gate agent beside him stopped him. He looked away, muttering, "It won't happen again." Sarah held his gaze for a moment longer before walking away. The encounter left a bitter taste in her mouth, but it also reignited her resolve. This wasn't just about implementing policies. It was about changing hearts and minds. People like Greg didn't change overnight, but moments like this were critical. The meeting with James. That evening, Sarah sat across from James Carter in his private office at the corporate headquarters. The room was warm and inviting, lined with shelves of books and family photos, a far cry from the imposing conference rooms Sarah had grown used to. "You look troubled," James said, setting down the papers he'd been reading. Sarah sighed. "There was an incident today at the airport. One of our employees, Gray, made an assumption about a black passenger and her son. I stepped in, but it felt like déjà vu." James nodded, listening carefully. "It's frustrating, isn't it, to see the same mistakes surface despite all the progress?" "It is," Sarah admitted, "and it makes me wonder, are we even making a difference?" James leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Change is messy, Sarah. It doesn't move in a straight line. You'll have victories, setbacks, and moments that make you question everything. But those moments are when you push harder." Sarah stared at him, absorbing his words. "What you did today matters," James continued. "That mother and her son left that plane feeling respected because you stood up for them. And Greg, he'll think twice next time because someone held him accountable." Sarah nodded slowly. "I just wish it didn't feel like one step forward, 2 steps back." James smiled faintly. "Small steps add up, Sarah. You're part of something much bigger than you realize." The turning point. In the following weeks, Sarah noticed a shift, not just in herself, but in others. Employees who had once resisted the training began approaching her quietly, sharing stories of passengers they'd helped and perspectives they'd gained. One evening, Greg caught up with her in the break room. "Hey," he said, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. I wanted to say sorry about that date at the gate." Sarah raised an eyebrow, surprised. "What changed?" Greg sighed, his expression sincere. "I've been thinking about it. About how easy it is to let old habits decide how you treat someone. I didn't realize how bad it looked until I saw it through your eyes." Sarah softened. "It's not about being perfect, Greg. It's about being willing to do better." Greg nodded. "Yeah, I get that now." A vision fulfilled. Months later, at a company-wide event, James Carter took the stage in front of thousands of employees, flight attendants, gate agents, pilots, customer service representatives, and corporate staff. The room buzzed with anticipation as he stepped up to the podium, the spotlight casting a soft glow around him. Today, he began, we celebrate progress, not perfection, but progress. He paused, his voice steady and clear. When I first acquired this airline, I saw an opportunity to create something better, not just for passengers, but for every person who works here. That vision began with the Passenger Experience Committee, a group of individuals brave enough to challenge assumptions and drive change. James smiled faintly. One of those individuals stood here as an example of growth and redemption. Sarah Evans. The crowd turned toward Sarah, who sat near the front. Her face flushed as applause erupted around her. But she stood, her head held high, and nodded in acknowledgement. James continued, his gaze sweeping the room. This company's success won't be defined by profits alone. It will be defined by how we treat people, by the respect and dignity we show every passenger, every colleague, and every human being we encounter. The applause grew louder, and Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. James Carter's words weren't just platitudes. They were the culmination of everything they had fought for. Full circle. Months later, on a flight home from New York, Sarah found herself seated in first class, observing the cabin crew quietly. She no longer felt like the flight attendant who had once doubted a passenger's place. She was someone else now, someone stronger, someone who had learned the power of accountability, humility, and growth. The cabin door opened, and a man in a simple gray suit entered, carrying a weathered leather briefcase. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as James Carter walked down the aisle and took his seat. He looked up, catching her eye, and smiled. "You've come a long way, Sarah," he said softly. She smiled back, her voice steady and confident. "Thanks to you, sir." James shook his head, his gaze warm. "No, thanks to you." As the plane began its ascent, Sarah looked out the window, watching the clouds roll by. She thought of the woman she'd been and the woman she was now. Proof that redemption wasn't just possible, it was transformative. And in that quiet moment above the world, she realized she belonged.